Despite everything, could the chances of a Brexit deal, of a trade deal between the UK, EU, actually be rising as we approach the end of the transition period at the end of this year? Well, apparently so, according to some reports. As ever, guys, if you could please start off by giving this video a big thumbs up, click subscribe and the bell so you don't miss future videos. Yes, now, those of you who are watching the Westminster channel or have seen previous reports will know that the sounds from government are that no deal, the chance of no deal could be as high as 60 or even 70%. And we even saw one French bank, the chance of no deal is even higher than that. But that seems to have been contradicted now as we approach the October 15th deadline that Prime Minister Boris Johnson set out for a deal to be done. And of course the transition period ended at the end of this year. But there's a couple of reports now that seem to point to perhaps the chances of a deal actually increasing at this moment in time. Now, the political editor of The Spectator, James Forsyth, who is very plugged in to the mood of the government, I would suggest, he has written today that a Brexit deal is coming into view. A deal is coming into view. He says that the UK side now view the remaining issues in the negotiations as being more about process than substance. A Brexit deal is within touching distance, is the full piece in the Times. Forsyth saying that there is a cautious but growing optimism in Whitehall that there will be a Brexit deal. At the beginning of this month, the mood was grim, he says, but there was a feeling that the talks weren't getting anywhere. This frustration contributed to the internal market bill, rash commitment to disapply parts of the withdrawal agreement. But there is now a more positive attitude, he says, a sense that things are moving and that a deal is coming into view. Now remember, James Forsyth, who's now saying that a sense that a deal is coming into view, he actually authored the piece that said from government, the feeling was perhaps no deal as high as 70% likelihood. So the fact that this potential switch, this change in mood is somewhat significant. Boris Johnson, of course, Forsyth sets out in the piece, Boris Johnson justified his threat to break international law by warning that without action by Britain, the EU could impose an effective food blockade on Northern Ireland. The argument was that unless the EU granted the UK third country status for agricultural exports, which it has not yet committed to do, it could prevent food being moved from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, which will stay within the rules of the EU single market. The threat not to list the UK was made by one EU figure, but calmer heads have prevailed. So Forsyth confirming there, the threat was made by an EU figure, and of course, as I laid out in yesterday's video, it was Lord Frost himself, it was Boris Johnson who highlighted this threat made by the EU to the UK, completely unacceptable. And many of you, by the way, as ever, keep your comments going, many of you pointing out that threat wasn't really reported much in terms of the mainstream media narrative of these negotiations. Of course, there was a lot of focus on the internal market bill and how it was supposedly outrageous to override elements of the withdrawal agreement, but not much coverage of that threat. As I reported yesterday, from multiple reports again, but Huffington Post UK had the story that the EU tells UK it will not block food imports after the Brexit transition. Michel Barnier reportedly telling the UK it will have no issue getting the automatic right to continue exporting to the EU, HuffPost UK understands. And that's important because what it shows you is that actually, despite all the bluster from some and the outrage, it shows you that the internal market bill and actually being tough in these negotiations has delivered. The EU backing down from their threat, and that showing that in itself helping to provide a potential pathway now to a deal being done because the EU backing down on that threat. James Forsyth goes on to say that in absolute terms, the difference between preparing to do business with the EU on WTO terms or with a free trade deal are not that great. But there is one significant difference, he says. In the event of a deal, the EU side would try to keep things as smooth as possible, but if there's an acrimonious end to the negotiations, their approach could and almost certainly would be very different. He also goes on to say that there is no good deal on fishing for the French fleet. It would come out badly from any compromise. What worries some in the government, therefore, is that this might deter Emmanuel Macron from getting involved in the search for an agreement. They fear that he might choose not to dip his hand in the fish guts, but instead let things slide to no deal. Then after a few months, when European capitals believe would increase the pressure on London to compromise, he could re-engage and tell French fishermen he had won them back a chunk of their old quota. And of course, fishing, the British fishing industry absolutely decimated and betrayed by being part of EU policy, a significant area in terms of the coastal communities that it could give a massive boost to and revitalise the British fishing industry in a massive, massive way. Obviously a massive opportunity for Brexit Britain, but obviously, seemingly, some in the EU concerned about that. Now, Ian Wishart, it isn't just from this one report, because Ian Wishart, Brexit reporter at Bloomberg, he's also saying it's looking increasingly like that the government's threat to break international law may end up being nothing but a storm in a teacup. Not because it's not being taken seriously, but because both sides, he say, want a deal on their future relationship. Lips are tight before the all-important final negotiating round in Brussels next week. While there's not quite a sense of optimism, he says, it's far from negative. And he says that it's very unlikely to be a breakthrough next week, though, leaving a very intense fortnight for negotiators to sort out things before Boris Johnson's 15th of October deadline. Also the day of the EU summit, and he says almost like the whole thing is choreographed. But he also directly addresses James Forsyth's piece in The Times and says, as number 10's briefing to The Times, as he describes it this morning, shows, there's optimism in London. Officials in Brussels, despite the noise about the small matter of breaking international law, feel cautiously similar. And in the Bloomberg report on this, it says, with a little more than 2 weeks to go until Johnson's own October the 15th deadline to reach a deal, several officials warned that the negotiations can now stretch into November or even December. So there's a couple of elements there. There's clearly still some optimism on the UK side and on the EU side of a deal still being possible. Whether that deal is now going to go beyond the 15th of October, is Boris Johnson going to allow that to happen? He set the deadline. He said that's when a deal needs to be done. Is he willing to push back that deadline again instead of going for no deal? Will we see this go right down potentially till December? What we don't want to see in the UK is any surrender whatsoever in these negotiations. It would be an absolute catastrophe if at the last minute the British fishing industry was sold out, if the government went back on everything it said in terms of the level playing field and, of course, avoiding signing up to the EU rules on areas like state aid. The indications are that Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings see the huge opportunity of having that Brexit freedom, the opportunity to gain Brexit competitive advantages on areas like state aid. So let's hope they don't trade that all in last minute just because they want to be seen to be doing a deal with the European Union. So that's the very latest. As I said, previous forecasts have said the chance of no deal could be as high as 70%, perhaps even beyond that. But it now looks like there is still possibly some optimism on both sides for a deal to be done. But of course, it isn't just about a deal, it's about what's in that deal. And you can rely on the Westminster Channel to be absolutely all over this. We do not want to see any backsliding from the British government whatsoever. No deal, as ever, is always better than a bad deal. And as ever, guys, if you've enjoyed this report, please give this video a big thumbs up. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell. And of course, you can support my work on Patreon. Thanks very much, as ever, for watching.